Hi everyone. I am starting a food photography, kind of food styling series on the channel. Now I know for a lot of people this video and shooting on manual mode is going to seem very basic, but it is definitely not basic for all, especially for those of us that like to just take the camera and then shoot on automatic mode. Going forward in this series, when I'll be talking about flash lighting and continuous lighting and all of that really fun stuff, this is going to be really the basis, how to shoot on manual, and then focusing on your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So that is what we'll be talking about today. And then I have a really nice bowl of noodles right there that I have prepared for you all, and that is going to be our subject for today. Okay, so the first thing to note is that in order for a photo to happen, 3 different things are involved. So very much like a recipe has various ingredients to it, these are essentially the ingredients to making a photo. First one that we're going to talk about is ISO, and ISO is just the sensitivity of your camera's sensor or the sensitivity of your film to light. And it's good to note that each of these have their benefits and their shortcomings when we adjust for them. So I will show you that in the real life setting in our noodles right here. So for most cameras, usually ISOs start off at 100 and then it can go actually quite high, 25,000, 40,000. And basically, the higher that you crank that number up, the brighter that your photo is going to be. And then the lower that that number is, the less bright your photo is going to be. So remember how I said with each of these components, there are benefits and there are consequences to adjusting the value of ISO. So the higher your ISO goes up, the more grainy that you will see that your photo becomes. So when you're trying to take a photo with your camera phone at nighttime, you start seeing like those little dots and those little grains, right? That's because the camera's software is actually cranking the ISO way up so that you can actually see your photo in a low light setting. That's why in food photography, generally we want to keep the ISO as low as possible so that you have a clean photo. Especially if you know that that photograph might be for a large advertisement, or maybe you're going to print one up and blow one up for a print, you want to make sure that that image is the least grainy as possible. So let me just show you. I will take one of these photos with a lower ISO, and then I'll be taking one of these photos with a very, very high ISO so that you can see the difference. Okay, so the second thing that we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Now in cameras, in order to let in light to make that photo, there are shutters that open and close. Now when you look on a camera and you adjust for shutter speed, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, what that number actually is it's actually 1 over that number. So if I adjust my shutter speed to 200, it actually means that the shutter opens and closes in 1 over 200ths of a second. So essentially, the higher up the shutter speed number is, the quicker the shutter speed opens and closes. And then versus you're gonna get down to your lower numbers, it could be like 1 or 0.5. That's actually 1 over 0.5. So essentially you are leaving the shutter open for 2 seconds. So here are the trade-offs in terms of shutter speed. So obviously, if you leave the shutter open for a really long amount of time, you're letting in a ton of light, right? And that means that you're going to get a brighter picture. Versus if you just have the shutter open and close really quickly, it lets less light in and then you're going to get a less bright photo. But with shutter speed, you have to consider something else. It really changes the game, and that thing is motion. When you open up a shutter for a really long amount of time, obviously it's letting in all of that great light, you're gonna get a brighter photo. But conversely, because you're opening it up for such a long amount of time, the camera is also receiving information on any movement that you make. So for example, if you are someone that shoots without a tripod and you shoot your camera handheld, and you say, oh, well, it's a really dark day, I don't have a lot of light, I'm going to decrease my shutter speed so that I get more light, but I'm handheld, your photos are going to come out blurry because your hands can't hold steady enough for that shot to happen. Generally, I think most photographers recommend that you don't go any lower than 1/60th of a second in terms of a photo, because otherwise your hands start to shake and it can affect the blurriness of the photo. So how do we get around this issue? You absolutely have to get a tripod. I mean, if you are serious about food photography, if you want to be exploring a little bit more into it, you have to be getting something that keeps your camera stationary. Of course, you can find different hacks to it. You can, stack up boxes and work around that, but it's going to be a lot easier, especially because you're gonna be tilting, you're gonna be doing a lot of different things. I'll put some of my favorites down below, but having a tripod opens a world of option for you in terms of shutter speed. So if it happens to be a really cloudy day, it's a really dark day, you can lower that shutter speed, have it open for a really long time, and not need to worry about your hands shaking. Obviously, if it's a great day, it's very sunny, you have artificial lights, you can shoot handheld if you wanted to. But generally, again, keeping into that rule of 1/60th of a second is probably the lowest shutter speed that you should go before you start seeing any blurs caused by your hands or just general like body movements. Okay, so the third thing to talk about in the exposure triangle is your aperture. And again, aperture is how big or small that opening is in your camera lens that lets in how much light. So usually when you talk about aperture, you talk about it in terms of f-stops. So, technical jargon, but essentially the lower that number is, the more wide open that opening is and the more light it lets in, versus the higher the number, like f22, you're talking about like a very small opening. Obviously, if it's a not so sunny day, it's a really dark day, you want that aperture to be wide open, right? Because you want to let in more light. Well, here are the trade-offs to aperture. You're essentially trading in light and brightness for areas of focus. So the wider open your aperture is, obviously the more light that you're letting in, the brighter your photo is going to be. But less of your photo is going to be in focus and more of it is going to be blurry. Now, some people like that effect, the bokeh effect of having your background be blurry and your foreground be in focus, and so that is an effect for some things. In terms of food photography, well, it really depends on the look that you're going for. Maybe if you're shooting an ad, generally they like most things to be quite in focus. So in which case you're going to have to think about, okay, do I want a wide open, super bright aperture but have fewer things be in focus? Or do I want kind of a lower light photo but then have everything be in focus? And so that is going to be your trade-off in terms of aperture. So let's go on to the other end of things. Let's say it's a super sunny day, super bright, you live on the rooftop, it's the middle of summer, and you've controlled everything else. Like you've lowered the ISO to the bottom minimum, you have a super high shutter speed, but it's still a super bright photo. Well, what you can do then is you up the number of the aperture and you close off the opening in your lens, and that will allow you to take off some of that brightness and some of that blown out effect that you're getting from your photos. And that would be yet another way to use aperture, but then on the other side of things. Okay, Okay, so now that we've gone through the 3 different components in a photograph, shooting manually and then knowing how to shoot manually will help you as the photographer have a whole lot more options in terms of food photography. So we're talking about lighting, whether you can shoot handheld or not, the effects that you want to give in a photo, you can all kind of adjust the different things that we've learned today to get that effect that you want. So I hope you all have enjoyed this video so far, and definitely be on the lookout for more intro to food photography and food styling videos coming up on this series.